This is the Fifth Estate. We have transitioned from YouTube to national television. We say the uncomfortable. We predict the future. And we are always right, except when we are wrong. Today, we will talk about the things that bothered us this week. Professor, what are these things that bothered us this week?
Hey.
Hey, bro.
Hey, hi.
Hi.
You talked about the Cobra Effect today,
Yes.
as we were doing the fight against corruption. You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Oh yes, it goes back to the colonial era in India, where there was a pandemic of cobra snakes, right? And the colonial government asked villagers in some funny parts of India to go and get them cobras while they were dead, and they would get a certain fee, let's say £10, right? And then the villagers went and bought cobras, but the cobras never ended. In fact, there were more cobras than ever before.
The population of cobras grew.
It continued to grow. And here's the thing. The colonial office actually realized that the villagers were actually breeding cobras. Right?
And selling them.
Yes, and this is the law of unintended consequences. You have a policy to achieve one thing, but it ends up backfiring on you. And this is the result on the war of corruption. You think you're fighting it, but it's like a hydra snake. The more heads you cut, the more heads it grow.
So, the point there for our viewers, you pay for cobras because you want to eliminate cobras. But the people you are paying for elimination of cobras discover that this is an opportunity.
Yes.
So they end up going and growing more cobras.
Yes.
Or is it breeding them?
They breed them like cows. And
They breed them and then they come and they sell them to you.
yes.
So instead of the population of cobras reducing,
It
they grew.
grows.
And in Uganda that thing happened on Museveni.
Right.
Museveni told the Ugandans, the Karamojong, to bring in their guns.
Yes.
And as they brought in their guns, what happens is that they discover there's an opportunity here.
Yeah.
Because if I give you my gun, you give me $10, hey, this is a business opportunity. So they came and they gave Museveni all their guns, but then they used the money they were given to go and buy brand new guns.
Yes.
So the question we are asking here is a man called DCI, DPP, and EACC, are they breeding cobras? Are they like going to catch thieves so that they can say we have 88 cases now in the judiciary?
Yes.
We have X number of cases, that we have caught, and now the cobras are even slithering their way into CS's offices. So that by the time we get to the CS offices,
Yes.
we'll be saying that now we have even caught 3 CSs, 4 CSs, and maybe even the entire government. That is what the Cobra Effect is. And that is one thing that bothered us this week.
Apart from the Cobra Effect, another thing that bothered us this week is a concept known as Libido dominandi. This is a concept that was introduced to us by GK.
Yes.
But, Professor, do you want to weigh in on that?
Don't know about this concept. I've heard about it, I've read about it, but I think GK should tell us what libido dominandi is about.
Libido dominandi is a Hegelian philosophy about the urge to dominate, the lust for power, and the idea that people want to stay in government. And so I made the case that maybe promoting or pushing for the parliamentary system is Gama's compromise for libido dominandi, staying at the table.
So, what GK is telling us is that the Gema nation may be suffering from libido dominandi. that they probably want to stay in power. They want to continue dominating. They want to continue being the dominant power. But the question is, does this have a link with the fight against corruption? Is this a situation where the dominant capital held by the Gema nation is cannibalizing the upcoming capital of people who are accumulating in the peripheries and wanting to get to positions of power, positions where they dominate, are being fought? Is that the situation? We have no idea. But when you talked about libido dominandi, that is what came to mind, at least for me.
The third thing that bothered us this week is this. Is the DCI using Hollywood theatrics to combat graft?
Yes, JM, I do have a problem with how DCI is carrying out these things. And it is a problem with quantity versus quality, right? William Ruto yesterday said, if you have a 9 billion shilling scandal, and out of the 9 billion shilling scandal, you realize that only 100 million shillings was stolen, and so you charge people with stealing 100 million shillings. Do you know what the public will ask you? Where is the 8.9 billion shillings? Right? And this is where government will shoot itself on the foot, right? Because yes, you've taken people to court for 100 million shillings, but there's an entire 8.9 billion shillings missing. Where is it?
So then, what we are saying on that point is that the over-enthusiasm of DCI, DPP and EACC to please the president and to make them look like they are fighting corruption is the same thing as saying, going to State House and saying these are the many cobras that we have caught. But in the meantime, telling the president that these are the cobras we have caught, because the cobras originally were found out there, but now they're being found in the offices of the CESs, is the same thing as saying that the cobras are being bred from within. But I think the point that you are making by saying that the DCI, DPP and EACC are being over enthusiastic is that government is a very secretive organization.
Absolutely.
And that is the reason why in Kenya, during the colonial time and today, it was known as Siri Kali. We call it Seri Kali. Seri Kali means top secret. Now, by the time you are exposing the workings of government and telling us that ministers that have been appointed by the president have stolen 4 billion, you basically are exposing the cobras that are breeding within the executive.
Yes.
And I think that's what you're saying, that maybe DCI, DPP, and EACC, in their enthusiasm in the fight against corruption, should be a little bit more careful. Otherwise, they'll end up looking like kind of youth wingers are enthusiastic to please their master, but they're hurting the master in the process. That enthusiasm bothered us this week. I think that's what you are telling us.
Precisely.
Another thing that bothered us this week is the difference between theft and corruption. Professor, you had a good distinction between the two.
In my thinking, theft is robbery. You go, you take 791 or 79 million, 150 million or 150,000, you add a zero at the end, it becomes 791 million. And that's what happened in NYS. They added a zero to an invoice of 79 million. That is pure theft. That you add a zero to an invoice and then you pay 791 million. Or you're given a contract to supply something, but instead of supplying it, you supply an alternative. For instance, you're given a contract to supply chlorine to the Nairobi city, city county, or whatever they call it. And then instead of supplying chlorine, you supply chalk. which looks like chlorine, and the water is not sanitized. That's theft. You are stealing directly by supplying the wrong thing. But corruption is distortion. Distortion means that you are working, you're working the system so that the system favors you. And I think that the methods that you use to fight distortion must be different from the methods that you use to fight corruption, or to fight theft, rather. So if distortion is corruption, theft must be dealt with cacophonously and directly, but distortion and corruption must be dealt with a little bit differently. This might sound a little odd, but we have examples of countries that have dealt with this a little bit differently. You were telling me, JM, about the case of South Korea.
Absolutely. So South Korea had applied a very unorthodox view to handling corruption. In their view, or in the view of President Park Chung-hee, the third president of South Korea, corruption wasn't so much a black and white, matter. It was actually an area in grayism. And when he came to power, he found oligarchs who had made their money in the time of the previous president, the first president of South Korea, who was in power for about 12 years.
Right.
And instead of prosecuting them, and these are really powerful people, instead of prosecuting them, he decided to co-opt them into his economic development plan for the country. So he compelled them to commit their resources, their money, their capital into building certain industries that he thought were critical for South Korea's economic development. Manufacturing cars, manufacturing steel, making semiconductors, and so on and so forth. And he, then told them, this is where you should invest your money. We will require you to give shares to the state as a way of making amends for the illicit wealth that you acquired. But the bottom line was, he, rather than go for asset recovery, he decided to look forward rather than look in the past and try and settle the injustices of the past, so to speak. So he looked forward, and that way, Korea really lifted itself out of poverty.
It was prioritization.
Right? And he prioritized, precisely. For him, the priority was economic development. So corruption was a sideshow, and rather than focus his energy on that, he decided to actually use it for development.
So maybe the point here that needs to be made is that corruption has a way of growing up, in a sense, and we're not celebrating it. Remember again that corruption is not theft. If you steal, Kenyans have a way of catching thieves. We say mwizi, and we follow you, and that is how Uhuru has dealt with it. But if you have distorted certain things, there are ways of also dealing with you, and maybe those methods need to be separated. GK, you're telling me a while ago about how the Italians ended up growing these distortions, and we are not celebrating corruption again. We're just saying that if you're underprivileged, what do you do?
And I think it just offers another perspective. I mean, here you had immigrants who the American dream was not open to them, and so they have to find a way to earn a living and to live, right? And so they found that they had to engage in other activities, so not the formal ladder up, but the crooked ladder, in order to earn a living, in order to keep sustaining their livelihoods. And so the idea here is that even mafia activities and economic activities would eventually sanitize their economic activities and legitimize, and over time become legitimate and sanitized. And the idea there is that, if you leave them to their own devices, sometimes they will evolve and formalize.
So what you are saying, GK, is that Chicago and some of the big cities that we have in the world were built by people who got up there through the crooked ladder.
Yeah.
And when they go to that particular point, they say, look, now that we have all these things that we have amassed, we need to formalize them, and we need to get an order that will take care of it. Is that the point you're making?
And so in that way, corruption sort of led to some efficiencies in a very weird, weird way. But it's an alternative way of thinking about it, offered up by Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah. So what we are saying here is that maybe Uhuru should consider the approach that he is taking in his war against corruption. We support him 100%. But one, we think it has the potential to come back and bite him. That is number one. And two, it has potential to send him into an abysm, into a pit, where he will go under chasing corrupt people, and then he ends up meeting the devil himself face to face in hell. And then three, Uhuru Kenyatta is not fighting corruption, he's fighting corrupt people. And if you fight corrupt people, you remove one corrupt person, they're replaced by an even more corrupt person. And we are saying this because corruption does not fight back, corruption corrupts back. You corrupt one person, you remove one corrupt person, you get a person who is even more corrupt kicking in. And if our focus remains on corruption, the case of South Korea, the case of Italy, we will forget everything about the Big Four. So for the whole of 2018, we never focused on the Big Four. Now this is 2019 March. When are we going to do what we set out to do when we elected this government for a second term? We never elected Uhuru Kenyatta to fight corruption. We elected him to make our lives better. And so this has bothered us. And one more thing. A minister was fired this week. We never saw that minister in the papers before he was fired. So it means that he's a small fish. But the big fish we've been seeing in the papers have not been fired yet. Is it possible that somewhere down the road we are going to have the ones who are not mentioned in the papers being fired? We are tired of these dramas of people being arrested, cabinet ministers being part of these corruption processes. And we are tired of it because we elected Uhuru Kenyatta to do a job. If he takes us back to his ministers and he tells us that 8 ministers are corrupt, very soon we will all go back to him and ask him, so we elected you to do what? To select or appoint a minister in the person of that guy who was fired today, a nondescript fellow, to do what he did. The buck has to stop with the president. These are the things that have bothered me, and I have been to church today, being a Sunday, and I have spoken my heart.